Good, good, good. Good evening, and welcome to tonight's discussion in honor of Constitution Day, which is an annual event to reflect on our nation's founding document and its principles. This event tonight is also the first in our monthly Mansfield Dialogue series for this fall. I'm Joanna Shelton, a member of the Mansfield Center Board, sitting in tonight for the Center's director, Dina Mansour. Before we proceed any further, it's appropriate to acknowledge that we are in the Aboriginal territories of the Salish and Kalispel people. We honor their history and culture, and we are committed to engaging Native partners in our programming, including in tonight's event. I also want to extend a very special thanks to my fellow board member, Tom Lopatch. Tom is president and CEO of the nonprofit and nonpartisan Center for, or Voter Participation Center, and the Center for Voter Information. He's based in Washington, D.C., but he's a proud native Montanan with strong ties to the state. Tom put this panel together and invited the speakers. Without him, this event would not be possible. With that, let me turn to tonight's moderator, who is Professor Anthony Johnstone. He is the Helen and David Mason Professor of Law and an affiliated Professor of Public Administration at the University of Montana's Blewett School of Law. He teaches and writes about federal and state constitutional law, legislation, election law, jurisprudence, and related subjects. His qualifications make Professor Johnstone the perfect moderator for tonight's event. So with that, over to you, Professor Johnstone.
Thank you, Joanna. Thanks to the entire Mansfield Center team, and thanks also tonight to our interpreter, Denise May. It's an honor to kick off this year's Mansfield Dialogues with a special Constitution Day edition, Does the Constitution Establish a Democracy? Reflections on Voting Rights. In 2005, Senator Robert Byrd proposed and Congress enacted a rider to Section 106 of Title 36, declaring that each educational institution that receives federal funds for a fiscal year shall hold an educational program on the United States Constitution on September 17th of such year. I guess we're close enough for the students served by that educational institution. There's actually an interesting question as to whether Constitution Day is a constitutional exercise of Congress's spending power, but in Montana, we don't need a federal mandate to observe the Constitution this week, and we are happy to welcome all of you. Whether we use the Greek-rooted word democracy or the Latin-rooted republic named in our Constitution, we find these terms refer to what some would call an essentially contested concept. What does democracy mean? Who votes? How? And what for? The Constitution, surprisingly, perhaps to some, contains few specifics on these questions. It leaves to states to set the time, place, and manner of elections, subject to Congress's power to override those state rules for federal elections only. And unlike most state constitutions, which contain positive grants of voting rights, the federal Constitution prohibits only denial or abridgment of the right to vote on certain specified grounds such as race, sex, poll taxes, and thanks largely to our Senator Mansfield's work on the 26th Amendment, denial of the vote to citizens 18 years of age or older. More general guarantees of free speech and equal protection of the laws prohibit arbitrary political discrimination in voting, including the exclusion of Indigenous citizens from the franchise, but federal courts have been slow to realize these broader rights. And the Supreme Court recently refused to enter the political thicket of policing partisan gerrymandering, one of the great defects in our democratic system. Now, Congress has the power to enforce voting rights, but has been unable to enact anything more than incremental reform since the historic Voting Rights Act of 1965. And the Supreme Court reads that law more narrowly with each passing term. Even as Congress is currently considering the most sweeping election reforms since the Voting Rights Act, partisan polarization and regional demographics have increased the incurrence of minority rule, in American government, with the losers of the popular vote winning 2 out of the last 6 presidential elections, and 1/2 of today's Senate representing nearly 42 million more people than the other half. Even though most of the amendments we have made to our Constitution since the Bill of Rights concern democracy and have expanded the franchise and updated our electoral processes, the Constitution's small d democratic blind spots are so great, and Congress's attempts to fill them are so old and brittle that recently we've seen documents revealed that show how close we came, shockingly close, to an invalid declaration of President Trump's reelection on January 6th, based on a tendentious reading of the Constitution that persuaded nearly enough people in power to reject the fully certified and exhaustively litigated election result. So there is no more important constitutional issue facing our nation today, and no better group of experts to discuss it than the panel we have at tonight's inaugural Constitution Day Mansfield Dialogue. Now I'm pleased to introduce our panelists in the order in which they'll offer initial remarks, and then we'll turn to the dialoguing for the second half of this hour. First, Chris Mann is a former political consultant and now an associate professor of political science at Skidmore College, where he studies the effects of voting rules and voter registration, and continues to consult for a variety of philanthropic and political organizations. Darren Shaw is a former political strategist and now distinguished teaching professor and Frank C. Irwin Jr. Chair of State Politics at the University of Texas at Austin, where he studies elections, public opinion, and voting behavior, and co-directs the Fox News poll, among others. And our last best panelist, who is now back in the last best place, I'm happy to say, is our own Denise Juneau, former superintendent of public instruction and one of Montana's great political trailblazers. She now serves as chairwoman of the board at the Voter Participation Center, and most importantly, is a graduate of the University of Montana's School of Law. The full biographies are available on the Mansfield Center's website. So, Chris, can you start us off with what you see as the major challenges you see to voting rights under the Constitution?
Sure. And thank you for inviting me and for organizing such a great event. My assigned task for these starting remarks is to try to briefly explain how today's progressive or liberal or left of center Americans view voting and the constitutional challenges around voting. The first challenge in this task is that despite how polarized the country is generally, there's actually a lot of common values about voting across large and often bipartisan majorities of the American public. It's easy to lose track of that when so much of the focus is on differences. But keep in mind, there is actually a lot of common ground. And Darren is going to go next as the task of explaining the conservative perspective here. And I think you'll hear a lot of common ground in this. Speaking of common ground, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge all the folks who run our elections in the US remarkably well. Professional election administrators in the counties and the states, the dedicated volunteers who staff polling places and count votes and do so much more. These are the true heroes of American democracy who make our elections and voting work, and especially those who did it last year in the pandemic. One challenge for me is also to describe a progressive point of view when there's considerable variation within each side of the political spectrum. In particular, there can be large gaps between the attitudes of elites and the general public, or between activists and the general public. We tend to focus on the elites because they're the legislators and politicians, they get attention in the media, but they aren't representative of the vast majority of Americans. And I think it's important that we keep that in mind as we try to understand what's going on around voting today. Related to that, there's a big difference between the progressive philosophical or values-based position and partisan moves around voting. So partisans will often make whatever argument they think is good for them in the next election, and that's usually based on the last election. And the last election, what happened in that election is often based more on who runs a better campaign than on any principle or even good evidence of actual partisan advantage, as opposed to just kind of refighting the last war. And for me, pre-election day voting over the last 20 years provides a really clear example. You can make a lot of progressive arguments for and against pre-election day voting. You can make a lot of conservative arguments for or against pre-election day voting. So voting by mail or early in-person voting. Before I was a professor, as Anthony mentioned, I worked in campaigns in the 90s and the early 2000s. And at that point, I was a really lonely voice in the Democratic Party advocating for voting by mail and early voting. I ran the New Mexico Democratic Party and had a showdown with the legislative leadership that actually wanted to repeal voting by mail because the Republican Party was so much better at it. Fast forward to 10 years ago, I was teaching at the University of Miami in Florida, and Democrats were talking about the same kinds of things because the Republicans ran circles around them. Now, fast forward to last year, and I don't think I need to remind you how different the partisan alignment was on something like mail ballots. So I want to try to a little bit separate out the partisan arguments of the moment that can shift from place to place and election to election, or at least over short periods of time, from a more general or at least more principled view. I'm going to focus on the progressive side, and I'm going to focus on one framework just to try to keep this brief. And that framework is that voting has had a historical progression towards an ideal of full and equal participation of all citizens. I'm trying to make an intentional play on words here about the progression across history and the idea of the progressive perspective. Hopefully that's a shortcut that helps you remember it and think about it in the future. So from this perspective, progressives see the current debate over voting in US elections as an evolution from the practice of the founding fathers to the ideals that we see in the Constitution and other founding documents. When the Constitution was ratified, voting was limited to property owning white males. That has changed. Anthony mentioned several of these steps over history. It's important to remember that most of these changes are led by the states. As Anthony said, the Constitution places primary responsibility for elections on the states. Congress only has a secondary role. And when we look at what the federal government has done, either in the form of constitutional amendments or federal law, it's almost always that that has followed the states more or less, largely to make things uniform or try to make them uniform across the states. These reforms often happen after a large majority of states, whether it's women's right to vote or particular federal laws, the National Voter Registration Act, those kinds of things. Actually, the 26th Amendment that Senator Mansfield, whom the center is named for, is one of the exceptions where that was really driven from the federal government as opposed to up from the states. The states generally had higher age limits at that point. The end of this arc of history is when we get to a place where there's equal representation across all groups in our society, and they're all participating at a high rate. And anything in the progressive view, anything that moves away from either high participation or equality is moving away from this promised land. One of the remarkable things about our current moment is that we have states headed in opposing directions, not trying different policies and going different directions in that sense, and not different speeds of adopting reforms, but different directions on the same reforms. And one of the notable features of the progressive view, and something that I think frustrates conservatives in this debate, is that the changes that are happening in the states are judged by progressives on the direction rather than the content. For example, Georgia has considerably more progressive voting laws, even after the recent controversial legislation, than the nominally progressive state of New York, where I now live. This makes for an asymmetry in the debate where progressives are focused on the direction of change, and I think conservatives are more often focused on the content of the change. And this leads to talking past each other. When we talk about the conflict over voting today, it's often simplified into this idea of access versus integrity. And the simplification is that progressives want access and don't care about integrity. Conservatives want integrity and don't care about access. The truth is much more complicated, or at least more nuanced, in the sense that both sides want both of these things, and it's just about the difficult trade-off between them. But when we think about where these things go, progressives tend to not see much threat to integrity for a number of reasons. I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A. But without that sense of a threat to integrity, it really leads to a focus where the belief in progress towards these ideals of equality and full participation is how progressives assess voting today. And it motivates them to want to be on the correct side of these principles and causes them to see any effort that moves away from access, even in the name of integrity, as cynical or unprincipled. So much more to say about this, but my time is up. So I'm going to stop and look forward to the Q&A and carrying on the conversation. So I'll turn it over to Darren.
Darren, so how would you respond to some of these concerns? And thanks, Chris, for mentioning the Q&A is open. Look for the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to respond with some questions we'll address in the second half of the hour. Over to you.
Yeah, again, thank you, Professor Johnston, and everybody involved at the Mansfield Center and the University of Montana for this opportunity. I think it's really great. Chris and I go back quite a ways, and I can assure you, having had a lot of experience with him on different, in different public forums and as part of panels, that in fact, he's right, and that other people on this panel will be much more instructive than we are. So I'll try to keep it brief. I think, look, in the sort of spirit of Constitution Day and sort of principled disagreement and an attempt to find common values, I'm going to reiterate many of the things that Professor Mann said. I'm not crazy about representing the conservative viewpoint on voting rights. I'll do the best I can to do that, and I think it's edifying. It was edifying for me simply to go through and try to develop a coherent viewpoint sort of based on a hodgepodge of ideas that the right and right-leaning interests have advanced over the last couple of years. That's not to say I necessarily disagree with them, but in many ways they're all over the place. There are a lot of arguments of convenience. So I'm trying to find common threads and maybe construct a coherence and a logic to it that doesn't necessarily exist sometimes. Okay, so with that in mind, you'll forgive me if I'm sort of reviewing my notes here, but I want to make sure that I'm kind of hewing to the text of the Constitution and federal statutes here. There really isn't, as Professor Johnston mentioned, much explicitly in the Constitution on the rights of the American voter. There is, of course, Article 1, Section 4, Article 2, Section 1, both of which grant the administration of federal and state elections to state legislatures. This is also implicit in a reading of the 10th Amendment. There is obviously Section 2 of the 14th Amendment and Section 1 of the 15th Amendment that grant the right to vote to Blacks and forbid the abridgment of the right to vote on the basis of race. There is a 19th Amendment, which expands the franchise to women. The 26th Amendment, which has been mentioned a couple times tonight, expanding the right to vote to 18-year-olds and up. And then the 24th Amendment, which, as Professor Johnston, I believe, mentioned, prohibits poll taxes, not only for presidential voting, but also for primaries, which is sort of an interesting quirk that you don't see elsewhere in the Constitution or in amendments to the Constitution. Then you've got a number of federal laws which do weigh in on voting rights that are relevant, most notably the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is obviously not the first Civil Rights Act or voting act that is relevant to federal elections, but it is certainly the most famous and the most relevant today. You also have federal statutes protecting the elderly and the handicapped. I think currently we refer to the disabled, which is a 1984 act. Protections for military uniformed and overseas citizens in both 1986 and then again in 2009. And then we have some kind of interesting national standards and practices that have been put into place, especially recently. The Federal Election Campaign Act of 1971 is amended in 74, Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002, Motor Voter, 1993, and then the Help America Vote Act, HAVA, of 2002. So while the Constitution is fairly narrow, there's been both in amendments and in federal statutes an attempt to expand federal protections of voting rights. There's still probably not as specific and beg for clarification in some instances, but it's not the case that the states and the localities have been completely in control of federal election administration and voter laws in the United States. But what's the sum total of this? Where does this all leave us? Well, a couple of points I just wanted to mention in kind of reviewing the sum total of all of these laws. The states and state legislatures still dominate when it comes to election law and voting processes. That's sort of fact number one. Second fact is there has been, as Professor Mann pointed out, substantial movement to increase both access and opportunities to vote. And this isn't just in the Voting Rights Act and all of the attendant enforcements of it. It's in the increase in convenience voting, in-person early, no-fault absentee, and mail-in voting, which have proliferated, especially since 2000. The 2000 election really was kind of critical in a lot of ways, which we can talk about. There have been substantial efforts to clarify and streamline the processing and counting of ballots. So provisional ballots, the advent of online registration systems, and then the advent under the auspices of HAVA state and countywide voter files, which have been important for not only voters in election administration, but also for campaigns. Now, all of this occurs at a time when political polarization has increased enormously. And maybe equally important, when the political parties, especially since 98 and 2000, have placed a greater emphasis on mobilizing their supporters as opposed to persuading swing voters. Both parties have aggressively sought to add voters to the registration rolls and to turn them out for elections. And this is a key component of this entire kind of argument and debate. Democrats, because they have a more racially diverse electorate, one in which it is still slightly lower in terms of socioeconomic status on most measures, there is an assumption that voters who are not currently on the rolls would, if they were registered, tend to lean Democratic. This is something that Democrats clearly believe. It's also something that Republicans clearly believe. Now, I actually think this is substantially overrated. I don't think the evidence about what the unregistered would do if they were registered and participating fits with this narrative. But in some sense, it doesn't matter. Both sides believe this is an article of faith. So whatever its merits, this partisan calculation is at least as responsible for the conservative viewpoint on voting laws as any principled stance with respect to federalism or the Constitution. In other words, there is a suspicion on the right that if you substantially increase access, that it's going to make eligible all these latent Democratic voters, and that's going to be a threat to Republican policy positions. All right. So now I'm not denying that there's a Republican preference for a narrower reading of national power vis-a-vis state power. That's, I think, true. But certainly this political calculation sort of goes into it. So you get, as Professor Mann mentioned, this tension between a preference for election integrity versus voter access. Both are necessary. I think members of anybody on either side of the aisle would acknowledge this. The question is where you draw the line. And so if I'm representing the conservative viewpoint, the simplest thing to say is that conservatives tend to draw the line closer towards election integrity, and progressives, if I may be so presumptuous, tend to draw the line closer to maximizing voter access. So, and this is, we could talk a lot more about this, but this is essentially where we are today. Now, when it comes to the specifics, and I'll end with this, evaluating, for instance, some of the more recent laws and bills that have come up in places like Georgia and Texas, the main questions involve two key principles. The first is the principle of one man, one vote, which is established in Reynolds v. Sims, and I guess a little more distantly, Westbury versus Sanders in 1964. And that's the Supreme Court law that says you have to have districts that are of equal size. So that's one person's vote in District A cannot contribute more towards representation than a voter in District B. That's a fairly, well, not narrow, but it can be construed narrowly, or it can be construed broadly. One of the things that you're seeing in places like Texas is a real skepticism about different voting practices. For instance, something as simple as the voting machines in one county versus another. Anything that can nominally affect the value of a person's vote in one county versus another is something that the states feel they need to address or clean up. And that's been something I can talk about later that's been lurking behind a lot of the laws in Texas. The other really important, and these aren't completely different, they're kind of hand in glove in some ways. The other important principle is racially disparate impact. And this is depends on your interpretation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Traditionally, Democrats and progressives, and you see this in some recent court decisions, tend to think that any racially disparate outcome is indicative of a disparate impact, and therefore, back in the days when we had pre-clearance, was something that would trigger a pre-clearance denial from the Department of Justice. So if you had a law that looked like it would create a system in which African Americans would say vote at lower rates than whites, then that was something that would be viewed suspiciously by the courts. Progressives tend, again, generalization, to embrace that notion. Conservatives tend to argue that what you don't want to do is focus on the equal outcome standard. Instead, you need to judge a law by the equality of opportunity. And because there are socioeconomic status differences and historical discrimination that has occurred across a lot of these boundaries, that the standard of sort of equality of outcome is not the appropriate standard by which to view changes or the development or evolution of election laws. Okay, so, and again, it's a little down in the weeds, but I think it's important, right? I think you guys will hear this in the audience, and certainly in the panel, we're familiar with this time and time again. One man, one vote standards and racially disparate impact, and how to interpret those. I think there are very, very reasonable principled disagreements on how to interpret those things, but those are two key principles when it comes to evaluating what's going on in some of these places. And with that, I'll wrap up and turn it over to people who are going to be more entertaining and knowledgeable.
Thank you, Darren. So I want to turn to you, Denise, and in particular, what this might mean, these debates might mean for traditionally excluded groups of voters who we still understand are fighting for their seat at the table today.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, everybody. And thanks for being here. And thanks to the Mansfield Center for hosting this event. I appreciate everyone Zooming in this evening. I know that The Voice is on TV right now, so thanks for choosing us over Blake Shelton. It is very interesting talking and thinking about the Constitution and voting. And as you already heard from the panel, there's so much history and legal wrangling underneath how we vote and who votes. How over time, the people have had to add in other people through amendments, people of color, women, young people, Native people. And so it's important to remember that our country did not start out with everyone being included, and that many people had to organize to make sure everyone does get included. And as states create laws around voting, even currently, there's still that fundamental question that needs to be interrogated about who is being left out, who's being displaced. In fact, that should be one of the first questions that get asked about almost all proposed legislation. Over time, we are learning that having an inclusive right to vote means that we all have a say in who represents us, and that representation can translate into better outcomes for all of us. Having access to voting allows women, Native people, and other people of color the ability, and young people, the ability to select those who they feel will do best by them. And that's really important. And that goes for our state as well. As a result of a lot of organizing, a lot of work on the ground by a lot of organizations and individuals, Montana now has 12 Native legislators, both Democrat and Republican, and both from reservation and urban areas. Their ability, the Native legislators, to introduce and pass legislation and to advocate from the actual elected seats within the walls of the Capitol, bringing their cultural values, their community values, their historical knowledge, and their perspective makes our state better. Diverse voices and lived experiences matter in elected office, and it matters that Native people are a part of the process from within. The Blackfeet Nation in my hometown of Browning, they've learned how to flex their voting muscle, and they now have representatives. They've had to do lawsuits. They've had to do a lot of work to make sure that they have that muscle to flex, but they now have their representatives, all Native, as county commissioners. They have an all Native school board. Those demographics did not always look like that. The school board can now make sure that Native curricula is included in classrooms. The county commissioners can now make sure that satellite voting is set up in their neighborhoods. It historically had not been. The Native vote has produced representation in elected office, and that produced better outcomes for their community. There's a long history of federal policy concerning Native Americans, mostly to get their land. And tribal citizens weren't even considered US citizens until 1924. So even after the 15th Amendment granted US citizens the right to vote regardless of race, Natives were still excluded. And even after the 1924 Citizenship Act, it still took over 40 years for all 50 states to allow Natives to vote. Now, that did not mean that Natives had access at that point. It wasn't that long ago that my mom and dad would travel 30 miles to Glacier County headquarters, and the clerk and recorder would give them 10 voter registration cards at a time. So drive 30 miles, pick up 10 cards, drive back to Browning, register 10 voters, take those cards back 30 miles and pick up 10 more. Tribal people have also had to file a lot of lawsuits to get representation on their local school boards and county commissions, even when they are the majority voting bloc, because of gerrymandered voting lines. For example, how county lines are drawn in Montana. The Blackfeet Reservation is in both Glacier and Pend Oreille County. So that dilutes the vote. Oftentimes in tribal communities, there aren't streets and avenues and the usual kinds of residential addresses. The mail is delivered to post office boxes. And so when voter registration cards ask for addresses and PO boxes are not allowed, that places a burden on access. When polling places are far away or have inaccessible hours, that dampens access to voting. Fighting for satellite offices in towns on reservations was an uphill battle, but when it works out, it does increase access. When legislative action takes away the ability to gather and deliver voter registration cards or ballots from elders or those who lack transportation resources or even just lack time, that dampens the Native vote. All of these things still exist. They're still being implemented across the country, and some states are even doubling down on some of those efforts. However, at the end of the day, it's important to know that when everybody is included in this most fundamental process of our representative democracy, voting, we will be a better country because we will begin hearing a lot of voices that have been missing for a very long time.
Thank you, Denise. Now we get to start dialoguing, and we've already got so many great questions in here. I wanted to start with a question to the panel posed by Richard, who discusses this, why are we concerned with too many people voting when we used to be concerned with too few? And I guess the way that I'd like to frame it, particularly since we have at least a couple of political scientists on the panel, is just what are the stakes? So on one hand, how much does vote, obviously Denise well reminds us that every single vote counts, whether or not it makes a particular difference in a particular election. But what difference does vote by mail or election day registration, for example, make to turnout in general? And on the other hand, what's the prevalence of election fraud or other threats to election integrity? Why don't we circle back to you, Chris, to start?
Thanks. Bunch of questions in there. We'll see if Darren agrees or disagrees with me about this. There is, on the question of how much these particular reforms matter, the effect is small and maybe none in a high salience election like a presidential year. It's maybe a little bit bigger in a midterm year. It's probably significantly bigger in like a mayor's race where only 20% of people are turning out. A lot of talk about the California recall election recently in the national news, where turnout was expected to be, midterm level or a little bit lower, and maybe that turnout was boosted by the fact that everyone was mailed a ballot. But it's really hard for political scientists to parse this out. Nobody has given a political scientist the power to assign which people get to vote which way, so we can study this and have control over it. And I'll take another piece and then pass it off to Darren, which is the question of how much evidence there is of fraud. One of the things that I point to is that even some of the strongest advocates of fraud, the Heritage Center, which is a think tank in Washington, has made much of this, and they created a database. But of all the cases they found over several decades of elections, which accounts for billions of votes cast, or at least 1 billion votes cast, we're talking a couple 100,000, right? 0.00001% kinds of numbers. There's another study that I use to illustrate this to my students, where a large-scale survey was done and people were asked, among other questions, whether they had observed voter fraud and whether they had observed alien abduction. And the rate of reporting alien abduction was actually slightly higher than observing voter fraud, which is to say that it's extremely rare. No question, there are cases where it happens. You can Google it and find news stories where there's fraud that's committed. But it is the part of the challenge here is the absence of evidence of absence. And you can look at the scarcity and say it's not there, or you can look at the scarcity and say it's there but not being caught, and that is the problem and why we need to act. So I'll toss it to Darren.
Sure, and how dare you, Professor Mann, deny alien abductions here in a public forum? But I'll let that slide. To take the last part of the question, Professor Johnston, first, there isn't much evidence of voter fraud in the modern context. It's not extensive to the extent it exists, and it's not systematic. That's just an empirical, observable fact. I think what people on the right and on the conservative side of the spectrum would point out, though, there are two things. One is appearance, and one is the potential. And the potentiality is, let's just say you have a place like California, my home state, where you have ballot harvesting laws, which is perfectly legal under California law. And there's no evidence in 2018 that ballot harvesting was used in any kind of fraudulent manner. Are you asking for trouble with ballot harvesting, though? Hard to say. I think there is an objection on the right to practices that have in the past been abused and could present the potential for abuse moving forward. I mean, my current home state is Texas, and the notion that there's never been fraud in American elections, which is not, of course, what people are claiming, though, is laughable for anybody with any kind of sense of Texas history. Lyndon Johnson's famously elected on the basis of alphabetically arranged votes in South Texas in his first Senate election. So, which, with the passage of time is fairly humorous, but I'm sure wasn't too humorous to Coke Stevenson or other people at the time. But there is this issue of appearance, which I think is, so here's what I think happened on election night. You have, and by the way, the Republicans brought this upon themselves, as Professor Mann suggested, by saying, don't use mail-in ballot. Whatever you do, don't use mail-in balloting. It's not legitimate. Well, then in a place like Pennsylvania, 90% of the mail-in ballots are Democratic. So those ballots have to be processed on election night and then counted. And so Trump supporters who go to bed on election night and see their candidate with 120,000 vote margin in Pennsylvania, watch over the next few days as these ballots that are processed and counted are entered into tabulation. Now, my perspective is I wish the networks would stop using active verbs to describe the counting. Those ballots are there. Biden is not surging into the lead on Wednesday or Thursday. They're simply processing and tabulating ballots that have been there in a legal fashion since Tuesday night. But is it ridiculous for those voters to say, well, how could this have happened? Where are these ballots coming from? I do think that creates some issues, which we can also talk about. I think, again, Republicans brought this on themselves by not using a legally acceptable form of balloting and sort of arguing against it. But I don't think it's totally ridiculous for these voters to feel that way, especially when they're fed by elites who keep pounding on these different conspiracy notions. So that's what I mean by there's this sort of potentiality as well as an appearance issue with some of these particular provisions. By the way, on the question, the initial question, though, which was about turnout and does turnout, why are we against it? I have no idea. If you look at the evidence, there is absolutely no evidence that higher turnout elections systematically advantage one side or the other. And the reason is fairly straightforward. All the political science evidence suggests that voters who come into the election, we call them peripheral voters, who don't tend to vote, but will show up for a high salience, high importance election. These voters tend not to be very partisan. Otherwise, they'd already be voting. They tend to be motivated by short-term forces. And short-term forces can favor Democrats or they can favor Republicans. And they're disproportionately likely to affect these peripheral voters. So you have high turnout elections where the short-term forces favor the Democrats and the Democrats win big. But you also have elections where there's high turnout and short-term forces favor the Republicans. I think it's a fundamental misunderstanding electoral dynamics. And I think both sides share it, and it's manifest in these oddly, intense positions they hold with respect to laws that I think a lot of us, all things being equal, would be very receptive to.
Yeah, I would just add in, I think that there's several things in there. I just recently came from Seattle. So one of the first things I did when I got back to Montana was register to vote here so I can be involved in the next election. But in Seattle, in Washington State, it's all mail ballot. And it's super easy. They send you a ballot, you fill it out, there's drop boxes everywhere. And so it was interesting to be in that space. And then to come back and find, that there are some suppression tactics and how hard so many people in Montana had to fight to get to a place where we had early voting, satellite offices, and sort of the attempts now to roll that back a little bit are really hard. But I think Darren brings up a great point about how the media really drives those short-term impacts. And you're right about how when people are watching elections on TV without knowing all of the background and how things play out, it really impacts how people perceive and view their vote and whether it matters, because there could already be a winner. And I mean, it just gets mixed up and mired in a whole bunch of little partisan social media, TV. And so it really is. And I know that there were some earlier questions about civics education, going back and making sure that we have that in place at an earlier age.
Thank you. Chris, you mentioned you had a quick follow-up on the turnout, and then we'll turn to John's question.
Yeah. One of the things that, Darren has said this twice or a couple times now, that this perception is hardened about Democrats benefit for higher turnout and Republicans are harmed by it. And that sets the stage for the policy. I think it's really important to remember that given the turnout in this country, even as high as it was, which is the highest in a century in 2020, both parties have a lot of potential supporters that sit on the sidelines. And, some of the most successful Republican campaigns have been those that have tried to mobilize their supporters, and they have a deep well to go to. Democratic campaigns have been successful similarly, have often been successful at mobilizing those supporters. There's a path for both parties to find that, and they do at that level. We don't see that. We see that play out in the campaign strategy, but not in the policy debate, which is a sort of watch what they do, not what they legislate at the political level. And I think we've also seen that if you're looking at the current landscape of these debates, where there are divides within both parties about what's worth fighting for between the campaign-oriented folks and the policy-oriented folks. Republicans pushing reforms may not be getting what they want, and Democrats who are pushing access reforms think that that's magically going to solve all their problems and they don't have to run a campaign anymore, and they're going to get bitten by that too.
So before turning to John's question, David raises the question of voting rights and floors and ceilings at the federal and state level. And I think one of the things that comes out of this last round is that, particularly after recent Supreme Court decisions, and without further action by Congress, is that this is all going to be decided at the state level, that whether we have vote by mail or ballot collection or any of these different reforms really are going to be decided at the state level, which means that those of us here have a greater opportunity to influence that at the state level. Much easier to change state policy than federal policy. So John asks the big question, whether our democracy can withstand a future contested election. What's the one thing that worries you most about the next big election? And why don't, this time I'll start with Darren, then move to Denise, and then back to Chris. What keeps you awake at night, Darren?
Yeah, I really wish I hadn't got to go first on this one, but let me try to collect my thoughts. I think as regrettable as the actions of January 6th were, I think it's easy to play a thought exercise, which is had Donald Trump won re-election by some small amount, the movement that had styled itself as resist after 2016 might have been more than just putting bumper stickers on the back of Subarus. moving forward. I think this deep cynicism, not skepticism, but cynicism about the other side and about American institutions is very troubling. And my fear is that you get a replay, that you get these intense debates about certain kinds of voting, that plays out in public policy debates, so that there's a more entrenched skepticism about, whether it's mail-in voting or other kinds of convenience voting, that one side eschews participating in that way, and then you get this consequent dragging out of the election results in a way that reinforces all the prior. I hate to use the perfect storm metaphor because it's so overused in politics and sports and elsewhere, but it really was a terrible perfect storm in 2020 when, these different, because of the pandemic, a lot of these expanded voting opportunities through different means were highly politicized, and the results came back in a way where, Trump dominated the in-person election day voting and Biden dominated the convenience voting, and the convenience voting numbers were calculated later. And so you just saw this play out. And my fear, frankly, it's not terribly original or insightful, is that you get a replay of that kind of dynamic. And so what I would hope is that, I think it makes sense strategically, but also in terms of supporting the democracy, if Republicans would simply, fight for whatever election formats they think are appropriate. But then when the laws are there, as Chris sort of suggested earlier, use them to your advantage. If there's mail-in voting, get your people to vote by mail. If there's absentee voting, vote absentee if it's more convenient for you, right? Use the lawful means of participating. And I think that will knock the edges off a lot. In that sense, I think the burden is on our leaders to take better, more principled positions. It would also be nice if our leaders would go back to the notion of principled losing, which somehow has been lost in the last decade or so. I missed the concession speech. I'm old enough so that my side has won and lost elections. And I always took solace in the grace and magnanimity of people who accepted that defeat and learned from it rather than contested the integrity of the process.
Denise, what worries you? I mean, you have lots of experience here in Montana.
I've had to give a concession speech, so
I'm sure it was wonderful.
It was awesome. It was the best ever. But I think that what you just mentioned, super scary, but that I think really is a fear that should be something that we are looking toward. I mean, what happened on January 6th was super scary and could definitely, that divide is so deep now, and the belief systems around our voting structures and winning and losing, and what that actually means, of having a leader in power and what they're capable of doing, I think is super scary, and something that we should all be working to make sure that we are, talking about integrity, and just like what you guys are talking about is making sure that everybody's playing by the rules, whatever those rules are, and see which ones work out the best for the most access for people.
Thanks, Denise. Chris, what about this? What worries you about the next contested election?
I won't repeat what Darren and Denise said, so I'm going to try to add two more specific thoughts. So one is, I'm worried about a trend potentially in both parties towards preempting the professionals that run our elections and do an exceptional job. They make mistakes, they're human. But this idea that, we saw January 6th, but there's also this idea that, secretaries of state can take over counties. Sometimes that's necessary and good when they're not well run. But that power could be abused. State legislatures moving to interfere in elections. Or one of my concerns coming into this next election cycle, where we're going to elect a lot of secretaries of state and local election officials, is that we'll get more partisan actors and fewer professionals. Another piece is, I think, specifically about 2022, a story that I think was lost is that a lot of the challenges before we had the riot, a lot of the rhetoric about the Electoral College was that some states' votes weren't legitimate because of the way in which they voted, whether that was by mail or early or some other piece. And we saw in the House, this almost played out in a Democratic challenge around how votes were counted in Iowa, a state that runs elections quite well historically. and a Republican won by a handful of votes. And if we get a situation in 2022 where it comes down to a Senate race or two or a handful of House races for control, and those arguments start to get out there, then we've really taken that difference across states and we're starting to rip states apart and pit states against states. And that is something that also scares me, that it's going to undermine the legitimacy of my state does it right, yours does it wrong. You're not really a state anymore. You're not a legitimate state, your elections. That to me is another danger that we haven't really seen, but that kind of poked its head up and then got swept away by the protests in the Capitol. But I think it's potentially scary.
Well, I'm going to try to give us a chance to end on a more upbeat note. One of our students, Kirsten, notes that the Supreme Court and therefore really federal courts generally have stepped back from protecting or promoting voter access. So I'd like to turn, and we'll start with Denise. What is one or more kind of key reforms that you would suggest to help us get out of the situation we're in now? And how do we get that reform done in today's political environment?
Yeah, I think it's all the kinds of things we've been talking about: early vote, vote by mail, anything that we can do to provide access to people so that they can get involved, learn about the issues and the people that they're voting on, take time to do that, would be good. And I also think that's possible. When we look at vote by mail, like I said, when I was in Seattle, it was pretty robust and a lot of people participated, but that also happened in Montana because of the pandemic. And Montanans all got a ballot in the mail with the stamp on it. And I think that increased turnout. And like Darren's saying, the turnout in Montana was conservative Republican, and they voted for who they wanted to. And so vote by mail worked here as well. And so I think looking at data and figuring out and being factual as much as possible with state legislators, it can be helpful as well. The thing that I know, most of my career has been in education, and when we empower young people to really help us determine what is the path and how can they help us determine that path. I know we talk a lot about young people and young people voting and whether they have big turnout, and we always go after their vote. And oftentimes they disappoint us a little because they don't turn out. But if we can find a way to engage young people, to teach them about their government, how they access it, how it matters, who represents them, and that they can have a say in that, that is what I think we really should look at, is this next generation and making sure that they know all those facts and then have access to be able to change it how they want to see it.
That's great. Certainly all part of a good audience here of teachers to hear the importance of teaching the value of democracy to the next generation of leaders. Chris?
Denise stole my thing, which is I was going to say civic education, right? Biased panel here of teachers. I think maybe call me an optimist, but the possibility that there could be federal legislation that will be bipartisan, at least in the sense that it will get 10 Republican votes to get through the filibuster, that will start to have some of these things that look like compromise to maybe turn the heat down a little bit. So in particular, earlier I was going to mention the voter ID provision in the new bill in the Senate, which the vast majority of Americans are in favor of voter ID of some form. Now there's a wing of the Democratic Party that says, no, not ever. But most Democrats are actually in favor of some form of ID, maybe a broader set of IDs being acceptable, and that's what the federal law does. And to find that common ground and bring that common ground up and make it a prominent feature as opposed to the places where there's so much harsh disagreement. There are other reforms that have been win-win, like automatic voter registration that produces both more accurate voter rolls and brings more people onto the voter rolls. But those are, there's some hope for those, but they're not going to be the prominent feature, unfortunately. I'd like to be upbeat. I try to be upbeat, but I just can't get there for you, Anthony.
All right, Darren, turn this around.
Yeah, come on,
Smiling.
Tom. Way too practical. I'm going off the board for completely impossible reforms 101. I'm not a big fan of Denise is practical also, and certainly mail-in voting and no-fault absentee voting are very popular. They've reduced the cost of voting, but I think they present problems for, this is going to be very theoretical, but democratic accountability. If I do vote early, I vote 2 or 3 weeks before the election. The presidential election, I'm pretty confident I have enough information at that point. I'm not so sure in down ballot races. And I think this notion of spreading voting out over 6 to 8 weeks not only presents administrative problems, but also presents some of the issues that we talked about with respect to, counting votes and after the fact. So my reform is forget all that stuff, in-person voting. Let's have a 3-day election holiday. I think that one of the reasons that Tom's correct, early and absentee voting don't seem to increase turnout by very much. And my colleague at the University of Wisconsin, Barry Burton, had an interesting idea. He says that election day used to be the Super Bowl, and casual voters would get caught up in the sort of democratic euphoria of election day. And that's been reduced because of the way we conduct elections nowadays. But, if you instead of having it on a Tuesday in November during working hours, let's have it start on Saturday, run through Monday, federal holiday on the Monday. Obviously there'd be accommodations for people who have trouble getting, making an in-person, casting an in-person ballot, which is considerable in places like Montana and Alaska and other places. But aside from that, let's turn it into the kind of celebration it used to be. I think a lot of that, hullabaloo that adds to democratic participation is something we miss with the current system. Is it practical? Not at all. Is there a chance in the world it's going to be passed? No, but that's why I'm in the ivory tower.
Well, thank you for something we can shoot for. Well, it's time to close. We're out of time now, and I just want to thank our panelists, Chris, Darren, and Denise, our interpreter, Denise May, who's kept going the full hour, and of course, the Mansfield Center for this critical discussion about democracy under our Constitution. This is the first of the series Mansfield Dialogue, so keep an eye on the calendar for the next dialogues in this series, as well as some interesting upcoming civic education initiatives to pick up on Denise and Chris's ideas. They're already acting on it, so that's good news. On behalf of the University of Montana's Mansfield Center, thank you for joining us, and please continue this dialogue with your fellow citizens. That is one easy and important thing you can do to sustain our democracy. Thank you and good night.